Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's event, which is New Synergies, Digital Finance Solutions for ESG Challenges. I'm Sonia Gibbs, Managing Director, Head of Sustainable Finance at the IIF. Thank you very much for joining us. We are really delighted to be hosting this series of COP Talks alongside COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. And this builds on our first COP Talk series in Glasgow last year, and on the vested interest of the financial sector in supporting a successful outcome at COP27 this year. It's really abundantly clear that the fight against climate change is going to require trillions of dollars and drawing on both public and private sector sources of capital. And digital finance can really offer some innovative solutions to de-risk and scale up and bring down the cost of sustainable finance. And of course, scaling private capital is the name of the game. So this panel is going to look at how new financial technology has synergies to help on the ESG data front on things like financial inclusion, climate risk assessment, reporting, and ESG investment more broadly. So to talk us all through this, we have an excellent panel and a peerless moderator, Jill Lofts from the Global Sustainable Finance Leader at EY. Jill, great to see you. And our panelists today are Ed Budd, who is co-founder and chief product officer at Adhara, Daniel Clear, chief executive officer of ESG Book, Truman Siemens, who's chief executive officer of the Linux Foundation OS Climate, and Akshata Udiyavar, who is partner, U.S. Financial Services Customer Growth Strategy Leader and Global Sustainable Finance Product Innovation Leader at EY. Big job. And Akshata, I understand you have a presentation to share with us. Yes. So go ahead, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sonia, and thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. I'm with very esteemed panelists and wanted to take the opportunity to really set context. So we are here to talk about a very in-depth issue that isn't easy to solve for. And so I wanted to take the opportunity to really just talk through what are we observing through the industry? Why are we here today? And why is data and technology coming to the forefront of an environmental and a climate crisis? So let's take a step back. Our society today overall is facing a crisis of trust, and over the last several decades, exacerbated particularly in several developed countries, including the US, the pandemic, unstable political environment, there has been a lot of cynicism that has really floored a lot of the economies that are faced in the world today. And ESG overall has no different and is being met with a healthy degree of skepticism overall. So we as ESG practitioners are at an inflection point when we think about what do we really need to do to continue to build trust and reliability in ESG and our disclosures. And it really boils down to something very, very simple. It is clear and reliable data to be able to support intelligent decision-making. The concept of garbage in, garbage out clearly applies here. So data is a very challenging foundational issue to what we're trying to solve for, because greenwashing, purpose washing is something that we really face on a day-to-day basis when we're talking about ESG disclosures. And as the data becomes more concrete, it has to become immutable. So in taking a step back and thinking about what has happened in terms of ESG data overall, there are really three themes that come to mind for me. And that is ESG data overall and the use of ESG data that started as a premise to really help investors create a baseline level of standardized data, support relevance in terms of their investor preferences, has now morphed into not just being used as investor decision-making, but also helping the leaders of those organizations to make very heavy decisions about their corporate strategy. And we are now at the precipice where ESG metrics are not just being used for corporate disclosures, but are also being made part of performance targets and part of executive rewards. And so this dystopian reality a couple of years ago is now very, very close to becoming something we all experience within financial services overall. And we are in the midst of having a lot of these conversations with our clients. The second challenge is really around the fragmentation of this data. So when we think about the data ecosystem, it is incredibly fragmented. You have multiple data sources. You're primarily relying on self-reported company data, third-party vendors, rating agencies, and there's clearly a challenge to normalize all this data. And it's driven by really maturing regulatory and corporate standards that are not yet coming to the forefront and are not as widely adopted as they should be. Standards such as the IISB has set out are really creating a variety of taxonomies and methodologies. But till this all comes together, the ecosystem is going to continue to remain very, very fragmented. The other blind spot here, obviously, is private companies. So we have a lot of publicly available data around public companies, but private companies still pose a significant amount of risk and a significant amount of blind spots for those that are in this space. The last challenge really is around how data is expensive. It is, Sonia made the point, how do you create accessibility around some of this data? And it is a significant investment. A stat that resonated with me is global spending on ESG data is going to reach $5 billion by 2025, and it was about $1 billion in 2021. A quote that Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, made recently really brings this all together, which is the next 1,000 unicorns won't be search engines, won't be social media companies, but they will actually be sustainability and scalable innovation providers. And so that really signals to us that the need for innovation in this space is really, really high, and it's not keeping at pace with where the industry really needs to go. And so what do we do about this? What are the 3 things at the horizon that we should be looking to that can help solve these problems? And it really boils down to artificial intelligence and natural language processing. Very highly technical term, but in an expanding market where increasingly ESG providers are creating ratings based on data collected through AI technologies. This technology and innovation-driven approach really makes it more transparent because you're scraping data, you're building it together in a very succinct manner. And if you use that automation and intelligence layered on the top of it with natural language processing, you can really start to unify some very disparate metrics that exist today that is really hard to collate manually, and it's very, very heavy in effort. The second is blockchain. So transparency and trust is really at the foundation of how blockchain came about. And along with its ability to be immutable, ability to be digitally represent assets and value that moves along supply chains, it's starting to become the standout technology to really introduce traceability into industrial processes, into supply chains. And so by using blockchain, there is a way to verify the transparency in a way that we haven't seen before. And businesses can dramatically improve their sustainability credentials as well as their reporting procedures as a result of this. The third is really technology around all of this. So I mentioned intelligent automation before, artificial intelligence, as well as Internet of Things, all very critical terms that are coming together, as well as technology and ecosystems that are coming together to create scale, as well as significantly reduce the cost that is driven by the manual nature of a lot of the collection of this data, as well as the third-party sources that get used to make this information more accessible. And so with the continuous emergence of disruptive technologies, this market is only going to grow over the next couple of years. But I feel like there's a cause for optimism. I mean, this space is very, very nascent, but is really ripe for innovation. And we're seeing, and we have several speakers on the phone today that will talk about the innovation that is being brought about in this space. So we have a large problem ahead of us, but there is a lot of innovation that's creeping into the space to help us really worth keeping a watch on it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jill to take us forward with the panel.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Akshata. Very clear and a heck of a lot in there. I heard trust, I heard rapid evolution of ESG data, fragmented data from multiple sources, the variety of taxonomies and frameworks, and of course, blockchain, use of big data, AI. And so I think with this excellent panel, we can start to get into some of these topics. I'm going to start with a question for each of the panel members. Same question to everybody if we can. And I'd like you, if you wouldn't mind, say in a few words, I'm going to start with Daniel. So Daniel, can you say in a few words what your current area of focus is and how you would describe the most pressing sustainability, data and technology challenges today?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. Maybe very brief background what we do. ESG Book, we're a 4-year-old company, about 220 people, and we provide ESG and climate data. So ESG broadly, climate in particular, data for about 25,000 companies. We do this in 2 ways. We look at structured data, so everything that companies say about themselves, and unstructured data, so what the world says about the company, social media, news, other sources of unstructured data that give you indications about a company. We then build analytics to make this actionable for investors. And we all put it on one platform, ESG Book, where all of that is transparent, accessible, visible. So you take away this black box character that many people, I think, always claim ESG has. And so if we had this discussion 3 or 5 years ago, and Sonia and I were working closely together, I was chairing the Sustainable Finance Working Group at the IIF, we would always complain about 2 things. We would complain about the fact that there isn't enough data, right? Companies aren't disclosing enough. I don't know what companies are doing. How can I make decisions without that level of intelligence? And the second complaint that we always had is data is highly inconsistent. While you can still make some of these complaints today, I think the world has moved on. And so I think the 3 problems they're really facing today are 3 very different ones. One is we have a lot of information about what companies want to do. We don't have a lot of information about what they're actually doing, right? So that move from promise to execution, I think, is very critical. Obviously, we had the COPs, Paris and then Glasgow, where people made big promises. People have signed up to the PRI, Principles of Responsible Investing, and hundreds of other coalitions. But it's very hard at the moment to put enough data against actual execution. The second problem that we have is, I think today we live in a world where we have too much data. Most investors would tell you that actually they're overwhelmed with the amount of data they can access. And what they really now need is people that help them to make it investable, make it actionable, and help essentially that huge universe of structured and unstructured data into financial grade metrics that you can integrate into your investment process. And the third big problem that we have is the black box character of many of the ESG products. And that then gives rise to political discussion and the backlash that we're currently seeing in the US, but also all of these greenwashing claims, because people say one thing and you can't really understand it. So I think the push for much greater transparency for me is sort of the third big problem that we are trying to tackle. And that's where ESG Book also comes in to provide something a lot more transparent that takes away that myth and that black box opaque character of ESG. I'll hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. And I'm going to go to, if I can now, Truman. Same question to you. What is your sphere where you're working at the moment, Truman, and what do you think is the sort of most pressing and urgent challenge around data and technology as we look into sustainable finance?
Great, thanks, Jill. First, a word about OS Climate. We're a community of practice and action, bringing together 15 corporate members, currently going to grow that larger, a number of partners now 4 years later from our inception, 400 plus members of the community, and about 70 who are making technical contributions to the development of a platform of data and analytics for climate aligned finance investment regulation, where the members are cooperatively building the solutions that they need. And now turning to your question, I generally agree with many of the things that Daniel said, and thanks, you stated those really quite clearly. I think there does persist a challenge around consistency because, in part because of some of the upstream, let's say, initiatives that we'll talk about later in the panel, vying for competitive advantage, notice in the spotlight of COP27, a flurry of sort of alternative sources of data. And I know ESG book seeks to sort of make sense of a lot of those. The OS Climate platform, the Data Commons, led by Red Hat, part of IBM, seeks to federate a range of sources into an infrastructure of data management, et cetera, to ease availability. One of the things that's a major challenge being addressed, I think, by some very important initiatives, and that we'll talk about in a moment, are the interoperability challenges. This is crucial for not only assuring that the data that is being used for important decisions by asset allocators, investment managers, et cetera, is indeed immutable, but also that, for example, restatements of data coming out of corporates are flow through, and that there's essentially the ability to time travel. So we'll cover some of those things, and thanks again to IIF for making this possible, and EY.
Thanks, Truman. Let's move over to Ed. Same question for you, if you wouldn't mind, Ed. So a little bit about your background in terms of your current area of focus, and your kind of a couple of thoughts of what are the most pressing tech or data issues that we're facing today.
Certainly, thanks Jill, thanks for having us. So perhaps from a slightly different perspective, our area of focus at Adara is really the nexus of liquidity, digital cash, and FX, which seems odd. So we're not an ESG born company, but what's quite clear in terms of the challenges that are filtering through. So we spend a lot of our time with regulated institutions looking at new ways of thinking about digital money, digital ledgers, the technology that sits under that we'll talk about later. And often that's been compartmentalized as about liquidity efficiencies, interactions with new CBDCs, or all of those other topics. But actually the challenge that we see coming through from customers that we're talking to about this is bringing that together with the challenges of creating transparent, credible, trustable data at the grassroots of financial processes is something that can be embedded into other investments, which ultimately may make the generation of this both quicker through existing initiatives, but actually embedded in the day-to-day of what's going on, which increases the credibility greatly, and the cost to deliver it hopefully is reduced as well. So for us, that combination of the challenges that you've outlined remain the same challenges. How they're solved for is, as we see it, being joined up with other types of investments and digital opportunities that there are out there that will ultimately, we think, end up in a more inline way of ESG being embedded in the core of what goes on, rather than necessarily having to have it in a parallel world, which is, and the particular focus is around that allocation of finance, the use of funds, the alignment of raising, using, and reporting of those funds.
Perfect. Thank you, Ed. Akshata, I will come to you. A couple of words on your background in terms of where you're focused at the moment and what you think the most pressing issues are.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jill. And I'll be quick. I've actually shared a lot of my thoughts, but where I'm spending a lot of my time at the firm at EY is really helping our clients think about really walking the walk, not just talking the talk. Daniel mentioned this, is now the focus has shifted from disclosure to transparency and measurement, and really helping our clients now to not just demonstrate that they can calculate their carbon emissions, they can report on the disclosure requirements, but how does that show up in their day-to-day interactions with clients and consumers? So really working with our financial clients to not just bring this disclosure and carbon emissions into their reporting, but also taking it down all the way to their products, their incentive systems, their corporate strategy, and really being able to use ESG as a competitive advantage in the market to make them the most desirable brand that consumers can relate to, really taking away the pressure of it being a compliance exercise and making it more something that they should just be part and parcel of their decision making going forward.
Perfect, thank you, Akshata. As you will all see, we kind of intentionally designed the panel with experts from quite different areas of the technology and data ecosystem. We're not going to have time to go through everything in the next 40 minutes, but really wanted to touch on the surface of some of these technologies and some of these different approaches and different perspectives on this. So let's start off with a question around the data specifically. Volume of data in the world is increasing exponentially, as we all know. In 2020, it was estimated that there were 64.2 zettabytes of data were created, which is a 314% increase from 2015. So let's hold those stats in our mind. I'm going to go to Truman. Truman, look, there are many initiatives across financial services aimed at creating open data platforms, utilities, in particular for climate change, but for ESG and sustainability as well. Really keen to hear your views on how these will evolve, and maybe what might be some of the key themes of, let's say, winning platforms or winning utilities out there in the market, and kind of where are we at? Where are we now? Can you give us a bit of a feel for those things?
Sure, Jill. And I think we all lose if we have the wrong patterns of competition. I think that's really important to note. Certainly commercial innovation on top of a common shared pre-competitive layer of technology and data that is a public good is highly desirable. For example, Daniel pointed earlier to scores that are developed. There's no one score that's going to be the truth, and in different investment managers will use those in different ways. However, having a source of truth when it comes to the data about what corporates have done, are doing, plan to do, and their progress toward their stated goals and targets is essential. And so actually I've just come to this panel from the Net Zero Public Data Utility Climate Data Advisory Group, advising Macron, Bloomberg, and the Data Steering Committee, where I think we finally have seen a convergence of the main initiatives, not all of them because there are so many, but the leading initiatives and substantial moves to coordinate those efforts and actions. I think that we'll all benefit from those, and in fact, you'll see, we encourage those watching who will be in Sharm el Sheikh to look to get together in workshops where we talk in a very concrete way about how we can overcome the barriers to coordination and collaboration. OS Climate will be hosting some of those in collaboration with Bloomberg Philanthropies and others. So I think that's terribly important. And, you know, to the extent of winning platforms, I think we all need to get over the notion that that there can be competing sort of forms of truth when it comes to the core upstream data. So interested to hear what my fellow panelists think about that proposition.
That's great, thank you. Yeah, so I wanted to go to Daniel now. Just look at, how do you see this evolving? I'd like to get your views on, you know, the commercial aspect versus the utility aspect. Do you see a role for utilities on a go-forward basis, or industry platforms in some shape or form? And where do you see, let's say, the more leading edge technologies around data existing today?
Yeah, perfect. And I think this works really well with where Truman was going. I think we need to separate two dimensions here. One is the availability of raw data. So essentially the availability of company disclosures. And then the second layer is what actionable insights you actually take away from that. And maybe that's where also the two elements of this questions come in. I think we're combining a little bit the big data discussion with the utility discussion. I think when it comes to availability of data, we now live in a world where there's more data available than anybody can consume. And you gave us some of the stats, and it's very, very clear that sustainability to a very large degree is a data problem, because you can only execute against something that you can measure. People only trust you if you give transparency, and that comes to the entire execution problem. And so I think it's important that when we think about ESG data and climate data, we're very clear that there is a disclosure set that companies provide. And there's a very large set of other data sources, satellites, social media, news, that you can use to turn random information into something that's actionable. I think it's quite important that we keep the two apart, because very often people will say AI will fix all of this, and I think it's just not true. The information that you get out of companies is so poor in quality, you still need quite a lot of human intervention, human analysts to make that actionable. But at the same time, you can use AI to read very large amounts of unstructured data and turn it into something that gives you forward-looking indicators where something may go wrong. Right? If you look at some of the biggest crises, corruption crisis, environmental crisis, human rights problems, you are normally able to pick them up 2 years in social media and the press before they actually hit the market. So if you're a clever investor, if you want to look at ESG and climate topics, you probably find out a lot in highly unstructured data, and you use big data, AI, natural language processing, and all these wonderful buzzwords to turn that into insights. So that, I think, that's the first part of the question. And I think there's a huge room for innovation to make large amounts of data actionable. When it comes to the pure disclosure sets, and that's where the utility discussion comes in, I think it is our only chance to make this into a marketplace that doesn't end up in a world where we're hiding information from one another, but actually we have one central data source. Regulators and initiatives from the European Commission and the like will be very, very important, because frankly, we failed to do it twice. We failed to do it with financial data, right? With financial data, we didn't manage to create one open source platform. There was less purpose to it, but that's why obviously companies like Bloomberg exist. And we failed to do it with KYC. With KYC, everybody tried to implement utilities, so not every bank would send out Excel questionnaires to their clients, and we failed, right? Nobody really managed to pull this off. This is now our third chance. There's a little bit more purpose behind it, because sustainability brings out company leaders and government leaders. And I think it is really, really important that the raw ingredient, so the company disclosures, become part of an open ecosystem where you can then turn insights. So I think what Truman and others are doing is brilliant. We've been connected for a while, and love to support this further.
Great. And then one, I think, a point that maybe joins together, Daniel, what you said, sort of downstream of the terrifically rich and valuable actionable insight that, and for investors and a range of different users that ESG book is pulling together, is that, you know, there's when you get to the OS climate contribution, we look at and are always trying to be aware of the aspirational. We're quite practical when it comes to what we actually develop on the infrastructure. And so a cascade of sources, both current and forward-looking sources, is ultimately what, you know, an investment manager, a credit analyst, a regulator is going to turn to with suggestions about the appropriate cascade from trustworthiness, but you know, always leaving the agency of those actors to make their own decision based on the best of their knowledge.
Perfect, thank you. I'd like to turn to Ed now, if we can. Ed, I know that you've been looking at sustainability data solutions for financial institutions themselves, and the work. You know, it'd be interesting to hear a little bit about the work you've been doing at Adhara, to give us a high-level overview, and you alluded to this in your introduction, of how you can join up the data across the whole of the business within a financial institution.
And then it picks up, thanks, John. It picks up on the point that Daniel was making there around the financial data in particular. So the challenge there is both the depth and breadth of it, but also the very structured nature, but yet seemingly quite inaccessible nature. So the key theme that we see coming through is using these types of technologies to think about establishing data lineage rather than one big copy of everything. Because ultimately, you know, if you think about the way in which the advantages, particularly let's keep it within a financial institution, of tracking money through multiple processes, but having particular rules and the taxonomies that are being well developed now associated with that as it's in line, you're able to trace activities in a way that your MIS is incredibly, you know, there's a possibility to achieve it, but actually by creating that lineage at source, you create a naturally well-structured and highly credible source of fuel for your reporting. And I think the critical bit is also that reporting can be accessed through many different lenses as well. There's not only have you got the shareholders of the financial institution around the financial allocation to service, but you've got your customers, you know, clients, corporate customers who need also lots of aspects of that data. So by creating lineage rather than MIS that lives and breathes on a day-to-day basis, the quality and unfortunately the quantity of that data will increase, but it'll be reusable by multiple parties. So it's really focusing on how do you apply those technologies that are being used for quite usual core banking processes to actually feed this challenge around the credibility and appropriate availability of data to different I suppose different actors from a bank's perspective without duplicating the data in an MIS sense.
Thank you. And I know we're going to dig into that in a little bit more detail when we talk about blockchain later. So we started big with the sort of the data and the big data question. You know, I like the fact that we talked about utilities. I like the fact that we talked about, you know, the sort of getting good data, rationalizing that data, doing the analytics on the data, where it might be most sensible to have platforms and initiatives versus where you're going to want in-depth analytics, analysis, interpretation, sometimes aided at some level with AI, but elsewhere very much detailed and potentially firm specific. So let's talk a little bit about disclosures and reporting. Akshata, I was going to come to you first, if that's okay. You know, clearly there are a lot of regs emerging on the disclosures and reporting agenda. As we've alluded to so far throughout this webinar, clearly reliable data that's understood, not just understanding what firms have done, but perhaps understanding their ability of what they're going to be doing next and are they going to achieve, let's say, their sustainability goals or their transition pathways. So maybe we'll come to you first, Akshata, and just ask you the question, you know, what role can international standards boards like the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standard Board, what role can they play? Because clearly there are, at the moment, lots of different taxonomies, lots of different standards globally. And, you know, can they play a role in harmonizing ESG data and reporting?
Yeah, short answer, absolutely yes. And a very, very welcome yes. And history is proven. Daniel mentioned it, KYC, other regulatory reasons why regulators play such an important role is having the consistent need and disclosures that they can really enforce. So if we think about, at least in the US, we've talked about TCFD and what IISB is doing right now. The SEC has obviously come out with climate-related disclosure requirements. There's the CSRD that is also being adopted by the Commission. So there are several different climate disclosure frameworks, and there are several proposed requirements, and harmonization across all of these will be critical to make this an asset to companies, to be able to use climate disclosures, again, as I stated, to make it a competitive edge, to be able to use these for smart decision-making around how they can evolve their businesses versus using it as a compliance exercise. And it really boils down to the harmonization across several of these frameworks. So we are seeing a lot of climate disclosure and international collaboration around many of these frameworks, and actually making them consistent in terms of what they require versus how many of these are actually just voluntary requirements. So ISV obviously is the most stringent of these that has come out recently, and several of the stated requirements are making things very consistent, are requiring companies to really go in and disclose streamline information. Again, the challenge becomes those that adopt it, and if private companies and others don't come under the purview, how will we really solve for several of these? But short answer, international regulatory collaboration, as well as the opportunity to really keep consistent US and EU approaches around climate reporting will really be key to success, because it remits the confusion around who discloses. And as all my esteemed panelists have shared, the opportunity to have very reliable but consistent data is really key. The reliability is only as good as it is consistently provided across multiple different providers. And so you're not trying to plug and play different gaps. So for me, it is nirvana if we can have a standardized regulatory guidance around these, because it'll make everybody's life much easier to have a consistent set of data.
Perfect. Thank you, Akshata. So let's go to Daniel. Daniel, be good to get your views on this. And I know time is tracking on. So just a couple of very quick thoughts, if you don't mind, around what tools or innovations you might have seen in the market that might help to address issues around data for reporting purposes.
Perfect. I'll be very quick. As an ex-consultant in my first life, I give it a bit of structure, and there are always 3 problems. The first one is really easy to fix. In most companies, sustainability reporting still sits with the wrong person. Right? It's very often with the chief sustainability officer, with the head of comms, with the head of PR. That's not where it's supposed to sit. This is a job for the CFO. Right? So the first one is really easy to fix. It needs to move into the office of the CFO. The second problem is a bit more difficult. Many of the ESG data points that people are tracking today are quite easy to find, right? The number of women on the board, if you can count, you can find it. You need to give a bit of structure, but you can do this. When it comes to scope 3 emissions, upstream and downstream, that isn't so easy, right? And I think that's your question was, what kind of tools are out there? There are luckily now a number of carbon accounting providers, carbon accounting softwares, and where it gets really interesting is if you can start to move into the world of IoT, the Internet of Things. If you are a big building operator, you can actually get your technology into the meter readings and the like. So it moves away from becoming sort of a paper tiger where you send around Excel spreadsheets or even worse, faxes, and you actually get data into a good system. But if I look at our data world, we track about 450 indicators. I would say less than 5% of these indicators are hard to find. The bigger problem is just getting them into a good infrastructure. And then I promised you the third problem is that people are facing too many different frameworks, right? So we track 3,700 different ESG frameworks with more than 1,800 unique indicators. Regulation will have to play a role there, but also there are tools by private companies. We're only one of them. We offer a tool called the Reporting Exchange, and the Reporting Exchange allows you to map indicators across different frameworks. So if you report against the SASB or future ISSB regulation, it will tell you in how many other frameworks is the same KPI tracked. So those are, I think, 3 of the problems people are facing, but they are not as big as they sound. And there are now, I think, quite a few solutions to make a move on that.
Thank you, Daniel. And I just want to check I heard this right. So you were saying that only about 4 to 5% of your indicators are hard to find. Is that correct?
Yes, because the majority of indicators, think about what is important for investors. It's horrible things like fatalities on your sites. You should know as a company how many fatalities you had. You need to track them, but it's not a terribly difficult KPI. You know whether the chairman is independent or if part of the management team. A lot of these S and G metrics and even many of the E metrics are quite straightforward. You just need to put the systems into place to track them.
Brilliant, thank you. Ed, let me turn to you if I can. So you're talking a little bit about how we ensure ESG data reporting can be transparent, not just for data analytics, but for investors, for employees, for the general public. And you touched upon this a little bit in the previous section, but it'd be great to expand on that.
Yeah, I think the multi-lens view and its credibility to each of those parties. So, you know, when we come on to talk about some of the technology aspects that you can use for that, you know, we've obviously got a great potential source of storing data for different people for multiple reuse in the blockchain space. The one thing I would counsel on particularly when we're looking at financial data, is there are confidential aspects to some of that structured data that builds up that credibility, and it's appropriate to, you know, one of the things with the technology is to keep those aspects in the right hands and the visibility to the right people, but maintaining the data lineage. So that's you know, quite a unique conundrum that the technology is, you know, potentially there to help us solve. It really boils down to, you know, storing enriched data at the point of use for multiple reuse. So whether that's looking at the way in which the proceeds of a particular financial instrument that's classified in a particular way is then that lineage stays with it through the use of those funds, and the way in which those bank accounts, you made the point on the you know, private companies and how to get, certainly on the financial side, how to get more of that data as part of the day-to-day. The answer is having it as part of, you know, the view they take, which is their day-to-day banking. The more it's embedded, the more it isn't an effort for them to do. It's, to Daniel's point, it's therefore in the hands of the right people as well, because at that point it's in the hands of the treasurer in particular, and they're able to supply that with ease and hopefully at much lower cost into the appropriate disclosures that they need to be rolling up to. So it's really you know, the key being storing things once, not all in the same place, but with the lineage that joins them together, with the appropriate visibility that allows, you know, different actors, corporates, banks, investors, to draw on what they need. And then I think that's where it's really super positive fuel for those aggregators and the indicators. Then you know what's coming in to provide those numbers, and it can be distributed on a, as I think the panel's saying, a much more open basis.
Perfect, thank you. And I'm going to stick with you now, Ed. I want to pick up on blockchain as a sort of specific topic, and I know we've sort of skirted around the topic quite a lot in the points that you've made, but you know, I think folks on the webinar will have come across lots of different potential use cases for blockchain within the ESG and climate change world. Really like to get your thoughts on where you see blockchain, you know, the whole host of technologies that come under that label, where you see those having the most impact in helping to progress and align ESG data reporting, etc.
Certainly. So let me pick on one particular theme. So I think there's a lot of really good ideas and emerging, you know, real life platforms, particularly around supply chain and the trade finance aspect that goes alongside it. I think for me, the thing that's going to make the difference, and the area that we particularly focus on, is understanding how you can embed ESG as a default into the definition of money, and as it takes these new digital forms. And that's a key component that needs to interact with those supply chain pieces. Most supply chain related opportunities in the blockchain space that will help drive different parts of reporting for ESG and the lineage of metrics that are important ultimately, one of the ways of joining them together is the money that needs to move at the same time, and making sure that the way in which that asset is programmed at source to be taking into consideration whether we do consider them rules or guidance or about carrying additional parts of the relevant taxonomy. That's something that's going to make a difference to joining up the reporting. But also one of the natures of this technology is if it's programmed correctly, you're able to create a level of compliance or adherence to rules and regulations as part of the process, rather than as part of a retrospective reporting and investigations process. So that's very, very focused, I know, on the financial allocation piece, but it is really in those scenarios, you see a lot of really good projects out there, but having that underlying set of ESG requirements also represented in the way in which money is being programmed in this space is going to add a whole new level of consistency. It will need consistent taxonomies, as was being highlighted, but with those embedded, you're going to be able to join things up in a much, much easier manner and provide that data into the various indicators that it can then fuel.
Brilliant, thank you. I was going to move on to a macroeconomic question now, if I may. Slightly change tack, and then we're going to wrap up with a quick round fire to conclude the webinar. So, Daniel, I'm going to fire this one at you, if I can. You know, we've already mentioned that the investment in sustainability data and technology is likely to be huge. The climate change and sustainability journey is a long one. There, of course, will be many bumps in the road, whether they be political, economic, or other. And we've already seen quite a few shocks to the system with the pandemic, war in Ukraine, energy crisis, etc. So it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on how you think FS is best positioned to navigate these. And of course, the other thing we didn't mention was the midterms coming up in the US as well. Yeah, just be interesting, because we're talking about long-term strategic issues, all the while having to deal with, I guess, perhaps more short-termist political changes or other macroeconomic changes.
Yeah, I think a brilliant question and so timely, because I think we're in the moment where we're testing ESG, right? And we're testing climate. We had 5 honeymoon years. They were brilliant, right? Everybody was saying the same thing. People were, with a few presidential exceptions, all working together on the same topic. And essentially, I think we've made huge progress in building commitments, moving this into the boardrooms, into the government offices. But now we're looking in a world where in the US you have sort of ESG fans and you have ESG haters. It's around the world, but in the US probably more extreme. You have a big divide between transition focus and record profits of oil and gas companies, where you would argue, why would you move away from that business model? And also you have obviously a lot of greenwashing claims. And I learned a new term recently on the opposite of greenwashing. You now have green hushing. Right? Green hushing is companies not talking about what they're doing on that front because they're afraid of being accused of either not doing enough or overstating what they're doing. So I think it's not a future theory that this may come our way. I think we live in a very, very important moment. What does it mean for financial institutions? There is no easy answer, but all I'm going to say is very, very straightforward. One is very clearly leadership and vision, right? It's toned from the top, and it matters so much now that chairs and CEOs stay strong and stay on course on this. And we have seen people move away from commitments. If you look at some of the Glasgow commitments, we already see people moving away from it, and staying the course, I think, is critical. The second one is we need to move away from that black and white debate. And I think be very clear, the next 10 years will be shades of olive. There is no black and white answer that is right. We need to be clear the transition will be shades of olive. And then connected with the shades of olive is much better transparency, right? If I look at take TCFD disclosures of financial services firms. They're all over the place. I can't compare the TCFD disclosures of different firms. I worked with Sonia at the time, and the IIF has done a great job together with EY actually to create better templates how to make disclosures more comparable. But until we reach that point where you can open the TCFD report of Bank A and compare it with Bank B, and you can actually measure progress and compare, that noise will not go away, and people will always go after financial services firms and accuse them of trying to profit from something that is dressed as something purposeful. So I think transparency disclosure is sadly a very simple but very powerful tool to hopefully address the current crunch.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. I'm going to move on to our last question now for everybody. We've talked a bit about big data, about artificial intelligence, about blockchain technologies, about the Internet of Things. So just to wrap up, I'm going to ask each of the panelists in a quick fire round to tell us what they think is the most important technology that is going to have the greatest impact on progressing climate change and sustainability. I'm going to start with Truman, if I can.
Great, thanks, Jill. And I think it's really important to focus not only on hard technologies, but also on soft technologies. Some of the greatest problems are much larger than any one firm can solve themselves. And so, we urge the viewers of this panel to join forces with EY and BNY Mellon, BNP Paribas, Allianz, Goldman in the soft technology of the Linux Foundation Community of Action and Practice that we formed to avoid wheel reinvention. Really important. We don't have time for wheel reinvention, to in-source knowledge and share it across with peers, and in that way gain a force multiplier for some of the solutions that are so badly needed. We do subscribe, as I mentioned earlier, to the net zero public data utility as a part of the solution that sort of is an expression of the convergence there, and encourage all to get involved. Look for the RFP coming out shortly.
Perfect, thank you. Perhaps I could move to Ed now.
Certainly. So from my perspective, when we're looking at the allocation of the financial resources piece, is to think about embedding it, having it in line, not thinking about it as a parallel process. And whether it's blockchain or other digital levers that people are looking at, it doesn't really matter. I think there's a lot of effort out in the industry to understand what can be done with new forms of programmed digital cash. And really the challenge is to think about that with ESG as a default, not as an add-on.
Brilliant, thank you, Ed. Let's go to Akshata, please.
Perfect, thank you, Joel. And I think most of the points that my fellow panelists have covered, the only thing I would add is one of the things we have heard a lot about is the data and the technology around it. But a lot of what we do in the industry today is really still on the defensive side. So we're measuring what is happening, what has taken place, what is actually being done in a company. We're not talking about the offensive agenda. How do you take analytics to help decision makers make better decisions, not just have, as Daniel mentioned, the fatalities on a site, but how do you say, how do I prevent the fatalities from happening on that site? So predictive analytics, in my mind, is the next frontier where we need to go to not just report out commitments and how you track towards those commitments, but also say how preemptively you are changing your decision making, your structure, your investment decisions, as Ed mentioned, to really make a difference, not just report out on how your business just performs based on disclosures and what you're doing today.
Great, thank you. And Daniel, final words from you, please.
Yeah, I'll be very brief and maybe controversial. I would say we actually don't need many new technologies. We have most of the data, most of the tools. I think we need to now really make sure we apply them and make progress. We had enough years of grand commitments. People now want to see execution. next year in the Middle East, in the UAE, we have the first big stock take after Glasgow. That comes around very quickly, and I wouldn't wait too long for the next big innovation. I think if you want good data, good tools, they are in the market. Hopefully a lot of that in open source utilities. Truman, hoping for you. And we're here to help.
Brilliant, thank you, Daniel. So look, it just leaves me to wrap up this session to say thank you to everybody who joined in today. As I said, we specifically chose folks from quite different backgrounds because we wanted to give you a little bit of a taste of some of the different types of technologies and the different types of approaches that are being taken on this agenda. I love the messaging at the end of this webinar because it feels very positive, actually. It feels as if we're saying the technology's there, we've got the data, let's go and implement it, let's use it properly, let's work out how we can make it usable so that we can actually start to really make a tangible difference on climate change and sustainability. I hope you, as I, picked up many really interesting facts from all of our panelists throughout this session. So thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you so much to everybody who attended. And for those who attended today, please do stay tuned for the upcoming webinar programme from the IIF on the COP Talk series. Thank you very much.